to have like little things that we do at the beginning, right? Like, hey, I'm Larry. I'm Glenn. And we're here with thoughts on Wesley.
Wesley. Yeah.
Stop.
This is great. Hey, we're starting week 3, and let me just say the thread of discussion over the last week has just been excellent. Mark, your suggestion of eating an elephant one bite at a time was very appropriate for me. Still hasn't helped. My office is still a mess. However, all the comments have been very thought-provoking, and I feel badly I haven't been able to answer everybody's comments, but the ones that I have been able to answer, I hope some of my comments to you have made sense. There's no guarantee since they're usually late at night, but I have really appreciated the discussion, so thank you, and keep up the good work. This week we're going to begin looking at some of Wesley's sermons and talking about what he's preaching, not so much how he's preaching, though that is part of the discussion because he's preaching outside. Whitefield has just encouraged him or pressed him or guilted him, maybe, I don't know, into preaching outdoors, which was a whole new concept for him. And somebody said in this last week's discussion how Whitefield had demonstrated to Wesley the value of preaching outdoors. And so now we're going to begin looking at his preaching and how he took that, made some adaptations, and turned it into the beginning of this awakening, this revival, and how it really transformed the culture, obviously transformed people's lives. But I think it also transformed Wesley and affirmed his calling. And it's almost like he discovered all that perhaps he was made to be and to do. So this is where we're headed. One of the interesting things is just the simple fact that we have all of these sermons. When you think about how they were recorded, when they were recorded, and you mentioned earlier how much of this really was done while he was on horseback or as he got older, he did ride in a carriage, so that might have made it a little easier. But you think about reading and writing while he's riding on a horse. Yeah, that's just phenomenal. And so we have all of these sermons to read and to think through. So that's going to be part of our discussion. So then, Glenn and I have begun a conversation between the two of us as it relates to biblical interpretation and exegesis. And that's the first question for this week coming up. How do you perceive Wesley's approach to biblical interpretation? And I wish I knew more about the methodologies that he may have been introduced to. I don't even know where or if that information would be available.
I've not run across anything.
Yeah. But as you're reading, think about the method. It might also be interesting for those of you who are preaching on a semi-regular basis. What's your approach to biblical interpretation? How might it or might not match with Wesley's?
So here's what's going on. What Larry's not saying is that he would accuse Wesley of proof texting and using things out of context in order to make his point. I think that that's what Larry's trying delicately to suggest in a class on Wesleyan theology. And I think that if you were to look at the way Wesley uses the scripture, you're going to discover that his methodology is probably different from the kinds of things that we've learned in biblical hermeneutics classes in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so it is an interesting question to me. If you're allowed to use texts the way that Wesley uses texts sometimes, where then does the standard of truth go if you're allowed to create allegory out of any piece of the Bible? For example, maybe it's creating allegory, maybe it's not, but that's the issue. Is when also, and to the point is, do our rules for biblical hermeneutics then become a standard that determines truth or error over the Bible? So now all of a sudden it's not the Bible that is giving us truth, but it's the tools that we've chosen to use to interpret the scriptures that give us truth.
Right. And the challenge for me, as I said earlier to you, is not to impose on Wesley what has been the standard for us and for me and what I've learned, and allow Wesley to speak and to give credence to what he preached, maybe if for no other reason, because of the results.
Sure. I know, it worked, right?
Yeah, it worked.
People's lives are changed and transformed, and not only just superficially, not just a sinner's prayer, which is important, but also the life of discipleship that happens afterwards, where people are transformed more and more into the image of Christ. And that's what Wesley's, that's his goal. To make disciples of all the nations, right?
Right. And he certainly succeeded.
Yeah.
So the methodology may not be as important as I think it is.
That's really hard for me to say as somebody who teaches hermeneutics.
Yeah.
It is an important counterpoint to the methods that we use.
Mm-hmm. And then the counterpoint to this, and we'll talk about it more later, but it could be part of the thread of discussion, is the famous Wesley quadrilateral, which he never called it the quadrilateral, but is fairly obvious in his approach, not just to preaching or teaching, but all of his writing, you get a sense that the quadrilateral was operational. And of course, those four things escape me at the moment. Let's see, tradition, experience, reason, and then Scripture. But for Wesley, Scripture was the overarching piece of the quadrilateral. The other three were under it. Is that how you've understood it?
That's how I've understood Wesley to understand it, but that's not the way I personally understand it, because I don't know how Scripture can be over reason when you use your reason to interpret Scripture, and then I don't know how Scripture can be over tradition when we received the canon through the tradition of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole lot of, I think that just calling it a quadrilateral is good with me, because those play, for me personally, but I think Wesley would have said that Scripture is the umbrella under which we use these other three.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, these are the things that we're looking at for the week, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and comments, and expand the conversation as you feel it needs. Okay? Blessings on you.